Alright, so these are the next two I wanted to touch on, which fall into that specific, but sometimes not so specific category of that basically 70s paranoid political thrillers, which there's like a whole list of. But whenever I hear just like that subgenre political thriller, usually, more often than not, these are the first two that always come to mind. But particularly 3 Days of the Condor, where it's like, whenever they kind of have a rise in popularity or something, and somebody asks me, like, what exactly is a political thriller? Just the easy answer to me to that always was just watch 3 Days of the Condor. That that will answer your question. Where that's, to me, that kind of is, I say, sort of like that quintessential thing where these are the two that I feel like really represent that. And when you see like other movies that are like homages to that era or try to do that kind of similar thing, it feels like it usually comes back to these two particular movies. You'll see referenced and sometimes even parodied or homaged, and that's where we are. And of course, both of these were kind of at the right in the middle of that whole Watergate era. So, like in any other circumstances, these might have been just like regular, ordinary thrillers, like cops chasing criminals or whatever. But not only did the protagonist kind of change a little bit and kind of adapt with the times, but it was almost like they were like horror movies at that time, basically, because it was like what you were hearing about in the news being sort of amplified for these movies, and in some cases, the Parallax view might be a bit more amplified, whereas Rays of the Condor might be downplayed just enough to where maybe they're not going completely overboard, and it's like it almost like there's a weird sort of realism to Three Days of the Condor that makes it even like scarier and more suspenseful as it goes. But as far as which of the two I prefer, I guess we can talk about that. So it is worth noting that both of these come from books. 3 Days of the Condor comes from the book 6 Days of the Condor by James Grady, which I have read, and it's very good and very exciting. Also very slender. It's like just under 200 pages, and it's constant. And like I said, even though there's double the amount of days in it, the movie cut it down by half. Still, just as much excitement in that. And The Parallax View is based on a book that I have not read by Lauren Singer, and apparently, from what research tells me anyway, some things were like the first half or so of 3 Days of the Condor is very faithful to the book, but until it kind of like around the time he first leaves Faye Dunaway's apartment, it kind of starts to go down its own path a little bit, and starts to bring in more composite characters and stuff like that. Um, Apparently, with the Parallax View, it started off with the main character being a cop or a detective of some kind, and it was Warren Beatty's idea to switch him to a reporter, and of course, because, following the Watergate stuff, reporters were kind of all the rage. Because Alan J. Pakula did the Parallax View, and only 2 years later he would do All the President's Men. And the funny thing about Pakula doing this movie is that, and I'm assuming it's because of this movie and because of All the President's Men, and because those movies seem to really significantly help define this era. There was a whole point there where I was first getting into these movies when I was much younger, in like my early teens, and there were so many movies that I just kind of assumed Pakula directed that he didn't. Like 3 Days of the Condor, for instance. It wasn't until I watched everybody else it was Sidney Pollack, because it has the feel of a Pakula movie, and stuff like The Falcon and the Snowman, which was Schlesinger, I think. Always felt like a Pakula movie to me. So like anything that has that sort of paranoid feel or that political feel and came out in that mid to late 70s or early 80s era, I probably mistook it for a Pakula movie when he didn't do as many of those, but he just made his name so synonymous with that area, just between these two movies alone, this and All the President's Men. Um, but on top of that, also, I believe the book was centered on JFK's assassination and witnesses to that. Whereas now it's this fictional character, but even though it's a fictional character, apparently it took inspiration from Robert Kennedy as opposed to John F. Kennedy. So as far as I know, those were the main changes, and that's the thing. Also, is looking at who our protagonists are in these movies. Where, like I said, typically you imagine somebody like maybe a bit more like somebody that's at least a more like hardened investigator type. Whereas regardless of what he does and what his means are, Beatty's character is just a reporter, and Redford's character is even less threatening. His job is just to read all day. His job, like, and Robert Redford of all people was cast as like a bookworm character, and you can sense even in the book you can sense there's contrasting things about this character's job and where it comes from with the way they set him up. But we'll get to those as well. I think I actually want to start kind of going more into the Parallax View came out the year before, so I think we'll start with it and then kind of work our way. And 3 Days of Condor might kind of work its way in and out, but we'll focus on the Parallax View and then come over to 3 Days of the Condor and talk about their different approaches to this kind of material, because while they do feel like very similar movies in like tone and the era they're representing and the stories that they're telling, they feel like pretty wildly different approaches. While 3 Days of the Condor is much more sort of downplayed and kind of information heavy and getting from one point to the next. And it feels like kind of just like a classic sort of almost spy movie, I guess you could say. The Parallax View, while falling under very much the paranoid thriller category, has a lot of action in it compared to other movies like this. Like, I wouldn't call it an action movie. It's pretty close to one, though. But we'll start with it since it came out first. And immediately, like, the whole movie of the Parallax View has this really sinister-ass quality to it. Like I said, at the time these came out especially, they might as well have been horror movies. Even if one is significantly more heightened. But taking that point, the whole idea that we see this whole opening scene where we see the senator assassinated, who's like there's going to be this big political candidate until this happened, and then we dissolve into this hearing as we go into the opening credits. And the way this hearing is shot, where it's just this long sort of table, and then they're looking out, this committee is all looking out, the way it's framed to where it's like there's just a big black box, and then just the middle of the screen is this sort of brown rectangle that's the wall, and then like the eagle symbol with these lights. And just the way this is framed, maybe this is just me looking too much into it, but it makes even more sense that these committee scenes bookend the movie and follow a significant death. The framing makes the wall and the emblem there look like a casket to me, in this really eerie way. And then you have these really small people, given how big the shot is, talking about how little do the people they're talking to realize basically the way these deaths are being covered up. So, now, with that being the start, like I said, just immediately there's a whole sinister vibe to this movie all the way through. So when we go into it, we have a time jump of like 3 years, I think, and Beatty's ex, Paula Prentice, the character's name is Lee, I believe, comes into this, and she's the one that's putting together, hey, remember that, assassination that we witnessed? Well, all those witnesses are getting picked off, and have been getting picked off over the last 3 years in really suspicious ways. And they all look like accidents, like heart attacks or car accidents or whatever. And with like airtight alibis to say that person could not have died any other way. So we're in the clear. And there's this incredibly jarring cut that, like I said, really sets the tone for this immediately. Like, you talk about Frady, the Warren Beatty character, the way he's brought into this and the way he's being told this information, naturally his thought process is, conspiracies. Like, that's whatever. Like, this is clearly a bit over the top. And I don't really believe any of this. And even though she's, like, weeping in terror, it's like, I get where you're coming from, but I just can't bring myself to believe it, because there's just too much that adds up. And then there's just a direct cut to her in the morgue. And there's, with, like, no in-between, no build-up. It's just, she's fearing for her life, and then she's already gone. Just like that. And I think that really sets up the tone immediately of just the immediacy of this, and like just how immediate the danger is from this point forward. And obviously that immediately brings Frady into it front and center, who is now going to get to the bottom of this. And in the openings, talking about like it being this sort of paranoid feel, and it's like, is it this thing or is it not this thing? One thing, I mean, it makes sense when you see the movie over and over again, like I have, but the fact that we see the mystery shooter in the opening scene, where it's clear that somebody is here to be the fall guy, and then there's the actual killer. And this incredible sequence in the opening where they go to the top of the Space Needle, and this fall guy, literally falls off the Space Needle, and then that covers up everything. Like, he was the shooter, and now he's dead. The end. You can sort of get the JFK vibes to this as well. But we see the shooter, who is Bill McKinney, who was the villain in Deliverance, the Mountain Man. And as far as seeing this from, like, the first time, I almost, like, a part of me kind of wishes and wonders what it would be like if we didn't see the other shooter right away in the opening scene, because we also get that sinister shot of him before it goes to the committee scene, with him, like, just sort of looking very sinister as he walks away with the Space Needle in the background, to show that, oh yeah, he is definitely the killer. So there's no mystery to that whatsoever, that this is what this is. And I do wonder how that would go, like, from a first-time viewing perspective, if we didn't know right away, and we were able to kind of try to figure out if this was real or just paranoia. Like I said, it does make more sense on multiple viewings, though, because on multiple viewings, it's not the kind of thing that would, like, be the same, have the same effect on a multiple viewing, so it's fine the way it is. And then talking about it going into what basically seems to be an action movie, is when he starts investigating, and just immediately people start closing in that very, like, that way that you can sense if you've seen any sort of paranoid thriller or conspiracy thriller or something, where, like, practically nobody can be trusted, and they set that up specifically, the nobody can be trusted thing, so well, with these first couple of characters he meets, because he goes to the bar and he first runs into the deputy, who is Earl Hindman, who was Wilson in Home Improvement. It's really jarring to see the bottom half of his face, it turns out. So, so they get into an altercation, and then he ultimately meets the sheriff. And the way they build this up, because you already kind of have a vibe of something is closing in, and it's like you're not quite sure who you can trust. But with the way this sheriff introduces himself, and it's like, it's almost comedic in nature. Like, this fight that he has with the deputy, where he's like, it suddenly turns into action. They are, like, full-on fighting in this bar. And there's, like, the whole thing where he throws Frady through the window, and then Frady comes back through the other window and attacks him. It's very action movie-like. But then when he meets the sheriff, then we kind of go back into the whole investigation aspect. And it's like, the great thing about this is he goes to the sheriff's home, and they go through all this stuff, and then this dude that's at the dam that might have this information. And they put a lot into establishing that the sheriff can be trusted. Like, all the way up, like, I feel like it's very crucial that he's literally in his home and they're going over information. And then when they actually go out to the dam, it's revealed that this other dude doesn't exist, and the sheriff is one of the people that can't be trusted. And then another action scene breaks out as the water is coming out of this dam. And during this dam scene also, something comes to light here that works really well also, is the way the movie uses sound. Where it's like, it's not so much that the sound gets loud, but it gets heightened depending on if it's appropriate to the scene, to kind of show how much danger there is. So when these alarms go off at the dam, it's, like, really, really loud. And then we get, like, once the paranoia has set in, it feels like, this could just be my imagination, but it feels like the sounds of phones ringing gets louder as it goes, but maybe that's just me. And then, yeah, after all of this breaks out, we get yet another action scene. But the thing is it's so well crafted in the sense, like, it's not like it's not like on the level of, like, Bullet or The French Connection or the 7-Ups as far as, like, car chases go. But it is a very good one, and it has, interestingly enough, like I said, given the context, almost like a Smokey and the Bandit vibe, how this car chase goes after he steals the sheriff's car and the deputy's chasing him. And that's the thing, is the car chases in Smokey and the Bandit are so well crafted. I don't mean that as, like, to say it's lower, just because Smokey and the Bandit is a comedy and this is a thriller. No, that's a good level to be at for your car chase. Like I said, we go all the way from it ramping off of stuff to going through buildings, and it's like it's a really big action scene for a movie like this, following a couple of big action scenes already. But it gives it like this sort of non-stop feel. And I guess this makes sense to talk about the fact that the cinematographer is Gordon Willis, who did, like, who's legendary, who did, like, all three Godfather movies, did all the President's Men, some Woody Allen movies. And the way he shoots this specifically the smaller scenes that aren't just the action scenes or the explosions, but when he's just kind of wandering around, when he's like putting some things together or he sees something he's trying to stealthily investigate, a lot of the beta shots are like from really far away. That kind of gives you that vibe that he's being watched by somebody, and it kind of gives you that vibe through the whole thing. Like, even if he sees somebody that looks really suspicious, or even somebody that might be high up for all we know, there's always the sense that there's somebody else that's a little higher up that's seeing all this, and afraid he's gonna eventually fall right into something, which can be really tense and really exciting, especially when it's pretty much constant. And some of the setting choices are really interesting for this as well. Like the Space Needle setting or the dam setting. There's also the moment when he's talking to the guy about getting his new identity, and they're just on one of those like small trains that just like go around a park. And it's like just little choices like that I can really appreciate, and it gives it some interesting sort of background, even if the scenes are just expositional or getting us from one point to the other. Choices like that can make all the difference also. Now, going into what all of this is coming to, the Parallax Corporation, which is actually quite terrifying because it's terrifying on multiple levels. The Parallax Corporation is, because there is the whole thing about how this may be a bit downplayed now, because sometimes movies can be like really super serious and be really impactful when they come out, and then if they get parodied in a certain way, that might be all you're able to see. And so I'm not quite sure how many people realize that the plot of Zoolander, of all things, basically came from the Parallax. The idea of recruiting people and then brainwashing them to be assassins is pretty much like, this is pretty much exactly where Zoolander got this. They just took it in their own direction, obviously. But still, this whole brainwashing scene, I guess that's what you could call it, is so bizarre, and like you're stepping into a whole other world. Like it's perfect for like the immersion of it, because you feel like you step into this totally other place, and the fact that we see this whole process, like the imagery, like from the perspective as if we ourselves are watching it. Like, we're not watching Frady watch it, we're watching it ourselves, which is kind of freaky and off-putting in a really good way. And that's a really creepy angle, but also the fact that at the end of the day, where this is talking about, like, after you've brainwashed these assassins, the way you just send them off to people, like people pay for them, and then you just send them off, and that's what it is. So it's like, this whole big corporation you would think would have like these really evil, sinister, world-dominating plans, and obviously they've got, but it goes in the directions of like the political directions, but I mean, when you come back to the Parallax Corporation itself, it's just a business, which is really creepy in kind of a real way, like in a bit of a too real way, that like at the end of the day, if you look at all the carnage this has caused, it all comes back to, as long as people in suits are getting paid, this is going to happen. So that's pretty terrifying. But going after the brainwashing scene, we have more of like what we had at the beginning, where it's like kind of one thing led to another, and then action scene after action scene. And then kind of stepping stone to stepping stone with the different people we meet. We've got a really big, long chunk of time here after he leaves the Parallax Corporation, where he sees this bomb being transported to this plane. And I really love those aspects of this movie specifically. The scenes that just kind of get, because you talk about the immersion of it, because if there's one thing you really want to accomplish in these sort of paranoid movies and get your audience in that zone, immersion's going to play a big part in this. And the way these scenes go on for a long time, and the way they pull us in, and how we just kind of follow along with him. Like, we're not quite sure what the destination's going to be, but it's like, that guy looks shady, what he's carrying looks shady, let's see where he's going and what he's going to do with that. And we just follow him for a long time. And then we get on the plane, and then we know that this is a bomb. And then the way this whole thing plays out, it feels like we're along for the investigation. There's like, especially on the plane when it's like the flight attendants are going around and they have like they're like handing out the drinks and all that, and everybody's sort of talking and all that, and it's like there's no score like building. There's no score saying this is really tense, there's a bomb that could blow up at any minute. It's just all the noise. But because we're so immersed in it now from Freddy's perspective, and we're even like looking specifically at his point of view after he informs his flight attendant through a napkin what's going on, and he's just waiting for her to discover it, and it's like, but all you hear is like the background noise of like, you know, drinks being drank in glasses, and then people talking, and then moving the trolleys or whatever around, and the way that builds up like puts you right on that plane in a really scary way. and it's exhilarating. It's really, really fun, but also terrifying. But talking about the music as well when it is used, which is really interesting, because I'm guessing we've gotten to this point now as far as doing the whole versus thing, that we are going from beginning to end for both of these. So if you haven't seen these for some reason, you probably already know too much. So so we're discussing them from beginning to end. But or if you don't really want to watch them, you just want to know what happens, you'll know that too. So there's that. So that pretty much gets us to our climax. And what's interesting about the way music is used here is how, like I was saying, they use it sparingly, which is great and really ramps up the tension. But specifically in this scene, when we get to this rehearsal where this new senator is here, that there is a plot against, that Freddy's going to try to stop. And we're in this big auditorium, and we're going through this rehearsal process of how this is going to go. And as Freddy's going through this building, and he's getting to like where the rafters are and all that, trying to piece all this together and how this is going to go down, we can hear the sound of a marching band building, and it sounds like score as it's going. And it's like, it's only as the scene goes on we realize it's an actual marching band that is in the scene, that is coming through. And that's utilized very well. And then really just the whole thing, I just want to say the balls of this climax. There's a number of ways you could say this is a ballsy climax. Like I was saying, it depends on how you feel about it being a surprising one, depending on the idea that the whole movie feels sinister all the time. So it may not be that surprising where it ends up, if you kind of hook on to that feeling, that tone. But the idea of this whole thing not being some giant political rally or some giant political thing, it's like a rehearsal where there's nobody around, apart from the marching band and the senator himself, is very interesting and very, like, there's something so cold and dead about it, quite literally in multiple ways, about how when the shots are fired and the senator goes down and crashes his cart in this really eerie, silent sort of way as he kind of just slowly goes through the tables until he just dies off. You like in any other movie like this, with something like this happening, we see it in the opening scene. Just chaos, screaming, crowds running, and the idea that it's just, there's like hardly any witnesses to this at all. And so just the silence of everything is so eerie in this really great way. And I just really love the climax. It's like, some people might see it as maybe a bit abrupt, because it doesn't, I don't know how many people will realize they're at the climax, because it doesn't feel like a climax until you realize that the things are happening right here and right now. And then the final tipping point, when Freddy gets caught in the rafters. These really great shots of him where we can see the floor of the auditorium and then him up in the rafters in the same shot. It's really, really well shot. And then now that he's been caught, he's going to make his getaway. And at this point, the rest of them, there'd be a whole other half of this movie where it would be him running away until he can clear his name and figure out everything that's going on here, and then the story will get out of what the Parallax Corporation is and all of this stuff. And then there's Bill McKinney, who we've seen throughout the movie, but we saw in the opening scene as well. Not a villain that gets a comeuppance in any way. He's right there waiting with his shotgun and just blows the star of our movie away, and the movie is over. But not before, like I said, we get that bookend scene of that committee one more time, and another one of those hearings where they just tidy everything up, get swept away. Frady was the assassin. He's been dealt with. It's all over. And this will just go on. That's just what happens. So that's pretty wild. And like I said, as far as like movies not having these sort of cut and dry endings, like I said, these feeling, and that's the thing too. If you want to keep going on that horror comparison, the fact that if there's one genre whose whole bit seems to be maybe 85 to 90% of the time nobody makes it out, and the final note is all the characters are doomed, and then cut to credits. That genre would be horror. But that happens an awful lot in movies in this area as well. With this one especially. 3 Days of the Condor also ends on kind of a dark note. Not as dark as the Parallax Eve in general. But there's a lot going on. So let's go on over to 3 Days of the Condor now. Where, once again, we meet our character that's not some really hardened investigator. As I said, Frady was much more sort of hands-on involved in things and getting out there and doing things that were potentially risky. As I said, Redford's character just has to read and potentially decode some things if he sees them. That's what his whole area does, and he's so friendly with these people. They're all laid back, despite you know, the crucial nature of what they do. They set up a very laid-back setting here with these characters to clearly have a dynamic. Like, he does the thing where he comes to the door and he dicks around, putting the mask on his face because there's a security camera there, and it's like they're all just, you know, whatever. Like, our job's pretty easy. We just do our thing, and then that's about it. And then, you know, we'll go to lunch at some point, and then everything, and then that'll just be what the day is. It's like any other workplace, basically, where you just kind of have one job to do at a desk, and that's about it. And I think it's because they set this up well enough that the following scenes are as terrifying as they are. This massacre scene where Redford's character, Turner, who is Malcolm in the book, I believe, so I'm trying not to get those mixed up, he goes out and he's going to get, you know, lunch for everybody, and it just so happens that while he's out to lunch is when these shady characters come in and gun down everybody here in a full-on massacre. All these characters that we've, in this very short amount of time, it'd be a stretch to say we know and love them, but we get that they know and seemingly love each other to a certain extent. And so that is immediately all gone, as everybody is just brutally shot down, or killed in various ways. And then right there we have a jumping off point, where Redford has to escape the same fate, that he was just very lucky to narrowly avoid. And so he's clearly out of his element. He doesn't even remember his codename right away. Like, he has to struggle to remember Condor when he's on the phone with these people. And just immediately, the paranoia has set in. We get the scenes where he's walking down the sidewalk and there's a baby carriage that somebody's reaching into. It's like, anytime somebody's reaching, it looks really bad, and he has to duck for cover. And that right there, you have a movie in itself. Like these scenes where we really use suspense, where I was talking about where the Parallax basically becomes an action movie for a while. And the 3 Days Condor does that on kind of a smaller scale, where we do have scenes that really build tension. The first one that immediately comes to mind is the alley scene, which is really funny, by the way, because when he's going into he's obviously told that just so you feel safe, we'll have a guy there that you do know. And when he gets there, it's Walter McGinn, I think the actor's name is. The guy that he's there that he knows is the same guy that played Younger in the Parallax View, the guy that was kind of like the recruiter that came to Frady's door and talked to him about the whole process and how they were going through like his application and all that, is now the trustworthy face, briefly, in 3 Days of the Condor before he is immediately gunned down. And we realize just how deep this goes, and then we're right back to where we were in the Parallax View after the sheriff confrontation, where it's like, alright, so there's really nobody we can really trust. So, yeah. And so we get scenes like when he's in the elevator with Max von Sydow, who to us has already been established as a danger, a very, very deadly person. And when we see these scenes with the mailman, the really creepy mailman played by Hank Garrett, which is always really interesting to me because I think it's just in this movie. Hank Garrett always kind of gave me like Bill McKinney vibes, who was the assassin in Parallax View, so that kind of lines up well. Both of them can play scary very well, and they do here as well. But there's a couple of scary things going on here. Not only the guys that are clearly out with the guns, chasing Redford down, and getting this close to killing him every time. We also get, like, the John Houseman scenes and the Cliff Robertson scenes, where, like I was talking about how the Parallax Corporation is basically just suits getting money at the end of the day. And yeah, when you look at, like, Houseman and Robertson and all them, all this background and all this terror we have going on and all this stuff we need to figure out, at the end of the day, at the very top, it's just guys in suits talking about death and murder like it's any other day at work. Like I said, just the way they go about that, like it's just regular business, and how once this is all cleaned up, they'll just go on to the next thing. All these bodies that Turner knew and that worked with, they're just another thing that's gone and another one of these problems that ultimately needed covered up. So that's scary in itself. But one place, really significant place, that I think the Parallax View has something on 3 Days of the Condor, like as far as I was talking about with the immersion and putting us in that place. And the book does this really well. 6 Days of the Condor does for a while as well. Where you want to be right in the perspective of these dudes. And I think a way the Parallax View really pulls that off really well is not really having many people come in with Frady. Like, we've got his ex who figures out what's going on. She dies immediately. Hume Cronin is there every now and then as his boss, but his boss really isn't much in on it either, and then he's ultimately offed also. So it feels like it's pretty much only Frady all the time, and every step he's got to do by himself. And I think that adds a lot to just the terror of it, and us being able to put ourselves in his position as we watch it. And I said specifically those point of view shots, like the one on the plane. 3 Days of the Condor brings in some levity, and has to bring in a sort of lighter character amidst all this, which is where Faye Dunaway is. And I don't know how much to take away from the movie, because the introduction of this character and where this character goes, it feels just as forced in the book as it does in the movie. Like, if anything, it's more rushed in the book than it is in the movie, which is weird. Where, like, the whole attraction is, like, instantaneous. And it's like, I get what they're talking about, where it's like, you know, he's the guy that's narrowly escaping death and all that stuff, and he's the excitement and all that. But still, the whole Dunaway angle to this movie has always felt a bit forced. I mean, I feel like it's a much stronger movie when we're just watching Redford by himself, like Frady and Parallax View, having to go from one thing to the next, without much help at all. And the fact that it turns into this whole, you know, love thing, we've got to get, like, the saxophone sex scenes, that feels very out of place, especially in a movie where time is of the essence. Like, literally, it's in the title how small of a window of time we're dealing with. And it feels like, it just feels like we don't have time for that. There's much more interesting things we could be focused on. But I guess that's also potentially just like a 70s thing, where it's like, the movies have to have this thing and this thing and this thing, because that's giving an audience the whole package or whatever. But I do think that's something that works very well in the Parallax View's favor, is it doesn't feel like it takes any detours, which is able to keep the tension ramped up constantly. And because of the Dunaway scenes, it feels like there are scenes in 3 Days of the Condor where we take breaks. Which is... And I can get it if a movie needs breathing room, but I feel like with this kind of movie, those thrive much more on feeling like kind of nonstop. Like even if it's not like actiony like the Parallax View is, just getting like nonstop unraveling going. We're getting from one step to the next, like frequently, without much stopping, and the way it ramps itself up. Because we do have like the way they do unravel things, is like when he's talking about stuff like, there's another CIA within the CIA and stuff like that. And you can feel the tension kind of finding its ground again. Especially when Max von Sydow has more scenes in the way, not just the scenes where he's following him around, but when they actually start interacting, which is kind of long awaited following that elevator scene, and everything before that even. Yeah, it almost feels like it takes detours, like because I mean, maybe that's not true. I was gonna say because the character's played by Robert Redford, but like I said, the book works the same way. This guy that's supposedly a bookworm, this job is just to read and decode, falls right into the bed with this woman that he's just kidnapped. It's a plot point that I don't think has worked in either form, book or movie. But there is something about the casting of Dunaway here where she is able to bring something to, like, she's not completely wasted in the role, which is good. Particularly the scene where she sits down with Cliff Robertson and they take him. When the movie kind of starts diverting away from the book's events, for the most part. And so there we can see where there could have been more of a dynamic here between them, that I don't think is quite there. It doesn't quite reach that. But they have moments, so there is that. But it doesn't feel as point of view centric as the Parallax View, so it doesn't feel quite as suspenseful as it could be because of some of these directions they're taking, and how we're not always constantly in the focus of Turner, which would probably amp up everything much more. So, like I said, also might be something that reads better, because another thing that's omitted from the book, and probably for the fact that it'd be hard to make cinematic, is the fact that his character, Redford's character in the book, is sick for most of it. So on top of all the stuff that's happening, on top of the alley scene and having to avoid all these people and finding all these bodies and not knowing where to go or who to trust, we get descriptions of like how much like the inside is like killing him, and like where he's got like this cold of sorts, and so that's something where it's like you get a real point of view perspective of where this is coming from, and how it would feel to be directly in this. That, as we saw in the Parallax, it could easily be done cinematically, but I feel like it's a bit more distance from his character's point of view than it could be. We're still very much in it with him, for sure, like throughout. Like I said, there's little breaks in tension in between I don't think we need, and I think they kind of hurt the movie. But then, once again, we do have to get to our dark ending, where it seems like it's lighter, more or less, than the Parallax View's ending, which is just complete and total darkness. Whereas there's... I mean, I guess if you're generous, you can say there's ambiguity in 3 Days of the Condor's ending, but I don't know that that's not really the way I've ever taken it. I feel like it's pretty... That last interaction with Cliff Robertson right before it cuts to credits abruptly, I feel like says the direction this is going. But you can take it for ambiguity if you want to. But the fact that when it all comes down to it, where you're expecting some big confrontation with Max von Sydow, maybe even something with Cliff Robertson, and then both final scenes just end up being those characters just sort of stating soulless facts about the way things are and the way they're going to be and why they are the way they are, and why the way people react to things is making that what it is, and how it's just so matter of fact of there's just not really anything you can do about that, Robert Redford. So that's just going to be what it is, and then they just sort of walk off into the abyss. So, like I said, equally dark, but like I said, if you want to go the ambiguous route with 3 Days of the Condor, I suppose you technically could, but I think it's pretty ominous. So, judging by that last Cliff Robertson line of how do you know, for sure, that the story will get out. So, yeah, so I think it's clear. I actually, back in the day when I first came across these movies, I liked 3 Days of the Condor more. But even back then, even at a very young age, I got the sense that the second half of 3 Days of the Condor is not as strong as the first half. Um, and but I still felt like I liked it more. But as I've, you would think it'd be the reverse since there's so much action in Parallax View that you'd appreciate more the more downplayed movie. But the Parallax View is so incredibly well crafted as a thriller that borders on that action appeal also. But also has those moments in it, the real tense moments. Where, like I said, it's willing to let a scene sit for a long time, and you really feel like you're in the position of the lead character, um, which is absolutely terrifying in a scenario like this. And like I said, the more real everything around them will feel, the more you feel like you're right in their point of view. And I feel like the way that it accomplished that was really effective. And so I really like 3 Days of the Condor, and like I said, it's probably one of the more influential movies of this era. Like I said, it's certainly one of the first things I think of, if not the very first thing I think of, when I hear paranoid thriller or political thriller or whatever. But these days, I'm falling more on the Parallax View as the more satisfying movie. So, like I said, there's that really dark and twisted ending too, where it's just all going to be full circle. Yeah. So I guess that's where I'm going to leave these. So the next thing is no need for ambiguity. I'll just mention it. We're going to talk about the Rocky movies, 2 at a time. We'll have one video that's 1 and 2, and then one that's 3 and 4, and then one that's 5 in Balboa, with like reviews and stuff in between those, including the new ones like Malignant and stuff like that. So until those, I think that's it.